Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you're watching this, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And I'm going to start this time with some thoughts prompted by the decision in the killing of George Floyd. I was happy that Derek Chauvin was convicted of Floyd's murder. I have to add that because of my feelings about the overall nature of the American criminal injustice system, I feel a little creepy saying that I'm happy someone was convicted of murder, but I was. Now, I wasn't surprised by the verdict. First, because the case appeared overwhelming and the defense is reduced to tossing out a string of could-bes connected to the idea that maybe some one of those could-bes just happened by the most miraculous of coincidences, just happened to be the thing that killed George Floyd at the same moment that his neck was being crushed into the pavement. But I also wasn't surprised because the jury came back so quickly, which is usually a very bad sign for a defendant. I was a little surprised, I'll admit, that the conviction was on all three counts. I had actually more expected the jury to convict on two of the counts, if only to give the impression, as juries often like to do, that they had given thoroughgoing consideration to all of the testimony. But this jury, obviously, and I would say quite correctly, didn't think that was necessary. The evidence was that overwhelming. Which, and leave it to me to find the downside of something, that very fact that it was so overwhelming could be our societal means to ignore the broader meaning of this case. Precisely because the abuse was so blatant, precisely because the indifference to human life was so obvious, precisely because the evidence was so overwhelming to the point that other cops testified against Chauvin, which is essentially unheard of, precisely because of that, we can, and I fear will dismiss this as an outlier. As something that doesn't reflect the day-to-day reality of how Black Americans are treated so differently by cops than white Americans are. Which is why the less shocking, but for that very reason more important case, is that of 13-year-old Adam Toledo, shot and killed by police in Chicago on March 29th. It's important because it's a more common case, one where it's not completely cut and dried and leaves essentially no room for dispute. And so it's also one where all the usual justifications and all the usual excuses are being trotted out. Now, based on body cam and surveillance video, it appears that Toledo had a gun. He had a gun. Note the past tense there. He had a gun, which he might still have had when he was confronted by the cop. At a command to "show me your effing hands," he turns, raises his hands. They are empty. There's no gun in his hand. So either he'd already ditched the gun or he tossed it as he was turning. In either event, his hands were up. They were empty. It made no difference. He was shot. He died. And another unarmed Black person is buried. But to the police, this was an armed confrontation, quote unquote, and prosecutors initially claimed that there was a gun in Toledo's hand at the moment that he was shot. Now, the body cam forced him to drop that particular line of bull, but the assertions that the cop was 100% right are already echoing, and the split-second decision banners are already being waved around. And the result will likely be that the cop involved will face no charges, quite possibly not even departmental discipline, which makes Adam Toledo more revealing than George Floyd, because that is the usual result. In 98.3% of the cases of killings by police between 2013 and 2020, there were no charges of any sort filed. And even in the tiny number of cases where charges were filed, in only a quarter of those was there a conviction on any charge. Meanwhile, Black people are 3 times more likely than white people to be killed by police, And those that are killed, blacks are significantly more likely to be unarmed than the white victims are. These figures are doubtless driven in some significant part by the same racism that has blacks perceived, especially by whites, as black males in particular, being perceived as bigger and more menacing than they actually are, and has black boys perceived as older than they are. 13-year-old Adam Toledo was described in the initial police report as being between 18 and 25. Reformers often respond to information like this by calling for improved training, but as others have pointed out, that will not solve the problem of the racism driving much of the difference in treatment, which is true. But on the other hand, that training does impact and it does relate to the overall question of police violence and brutality, because not being black is no guarantee against mistreatment by police. Just ask the water protectors at the Dakota Access Pipeline encampment. Just ask pretty much any 60s anti-war or anti-corporate demonstrator. Because the fact is, the very way we treat police makes the brutality more likely. And I'm not referring here to things like, well, we should teach them de-escalation techniques or anything like that. I'm not talking about what we should do. I'm talking about what we do. And the reality is, we are teaching police to be afraid. We are teaching them to be scared all the time. We are teaching them to think of every cop as a potential suspect and quite possibly a potential assailant. One notorious example of this is the so-called 21-foot rule, or the Tueller drill. Now, even though this was only originally intended as a training exercise, it is actively taught in some police academies and is widely adopted, at least informally, by police forces around the country. It is the idea that someone with a bladed weapon who is less than 21 feet away from you can attack and kill you before you as a cop can unholster your gun and get off a decent shot. Now, it has been debunked, but it still leaves police with the feeling that anyone within 21 feet of them is a potential risk to their lives. But the thing, it's not just that rule. It's not just that rule. It's an overall pattern, an overall way of thinking, an overall way of thinking that gets instilled in cops and leaves them in a constant state of stress. And notice I don't say alertness, I said stress. I talked about this before, actually. I talked about it as long ago as 6 years ago, how when watching videos of shootings by police, one thing I was repeatedly struck by is how often the cops sounded scared, even though they were the ones with the guns. I particularly remember the shooting of Philando Castile. The cop has the gun. It's out of his holster. It's in his hand. It's pointed at Castile, who has his hands out. He's obviously unarmed. He's sitting down. But despite all that, I clearly remember thinking that the cop in this encounter sounded terrified. And that certainly was not the only example. All of which brings us to the killing of Daunte Wright by a cop named Kim Potter in a suburb of Minneapolis on April 11th. This is the case of the cop shooting him with her gun, supposedly thinking she was wielding a taser. And it demonstrated what I maintain are multiple wrongs with the way we train police. First off, the male cop who first approached the car was there. He was there with his gun out and demanding Wright get out of the car. Now, Wright says, "For what?" And the cop answers, "I'll explain to you when you get out of the car." Now, right off, cops are taught that they have to be in control of the situation. They have to dominate the situation at all times. Why couldn't this cop simply have said, "Because you have an expired inspection sticker," which supposedly is the reason they pulled him over in the first place? Why couldn't he just answer the question instead of responding, in effect, "Be quiet and do what I tell you"? He's raising the tension. Why couldn't he have done it? Because that's how he was taught. That's what he's taught. You're taught to be in charge, and the only acceptable response is passive submission. Now, Wright starts to get out of his car, but then tries to get back in. Potter runs up to join the other cop. The tension is already running really high. Potter is heard shouting, "I'll tase you, taser, taser, taser." And then a second later, "Holy shit, I shot him." Now, in the wake of this, the police chief there says he believes Potter intended to draw her taser, but mistakenly pulled out her gun. And that was a claim that was widely ridiculed by the community and civil rights activists. And on its face, it does seem absurd. A cop's gun is about a pound heavier than a taser. It's a different color, has at least a somewhat different feel, and is holstered on the opposite side of her body. So here's the question. Can I believe Potter told the truth? Can I believe that she shot Daunte Wright thinking she was tasering him? And the answer is yes, I can. And again, it relates to failures in how we train police. Most police departments, including the one here, require that officers carry their guns on their dominant side and the tasers on the opposite side, which supposedly is going to lower the risk of confusing the two. But the instant I heard some criminal justice experts say that, my immediate reaction was, no, that's wrong, that's stupid, that's the opposite of what it should be. Because under stress, in a high-stress, adrenaline-pumping situation, you are going to resort to your dominant hand. It's going to default to your dominant hand. Having your gun on your dominant side is going to increase the risk of cases like that of Daunte Wright. Now, Betsy Branter Smith of the National Police Association said it's called slip and capture, and like it to getting into a rental car, going to start it up, and reaching for how you start your own car before you realize you're in a completely different place. It's also called muscle memory. And you've experienced, I guarantee you have experienced this. Hell, I have a car I've owned for 6 months now, and I've only just now stopped reaching for the gear shift in the wrong place. You have experienced this, and you weren't even under stress. What's more, this is not the first time this has happened. There are documented cases of police killing somebody with their gun, intending to use their taser. So, can I believe that Kim Potter killed Daunte Wright thinking she was tasering him? And the answer is yes, I can, because of the way she was trained. Now, it shouldn't be necessary to say this, but it probably is. That does not excuse what she did. In the immortal words of Mr. Spock, I understand, I do not approve. And it doesn't mean we can't say that racism was not a factor in the killing of Daunte Wright. If only because, at bottom line, we cannot actually extract racism from any encounter between blacks and whites in this country. So yes, it is quite true that we cannot address the issue of police violence and brutality without addressing the issue of racism, and particularly in our police forces and our society in general. But it is equally true that we cannot address police violence and brutality until we address the way police are taught. All right, we're going to move on from there to something I'm just going to mention very quickly because I know for a fact you know about this. I don't need to tell you about this, but I did want to make sure that I mentioned it. President Joe Biden has announced that all U.S. forces are being pulled out of Afghanistan by September 11th, ending America's longest war after 20 years after it started. This is the move that was supported even by veterans groups across the political spectrum and by both Democrats and Republicans in Congress. NATO forces, by the way, are also being pulled out by that same deadline. Despite that, bipartisan support, there are still some people saying, in essence, that 20 years of war and $2 trillion is not enough. That withdrawal has to be conditions-based, which essentially means we can only pull out when we win. In other words, the killing has to continue until we win. Or because the threat, they say, is that otherwise Afghanistan will descend into civil war, as if that's not what it has been experiencing for the last 20 plus years. Now, there is some wiggle room in this withdrawal. The idea is that there are going to be sufficient forces left in the region for counterterrorism and to put a check on the Taliban. But even so. By the way, there is a response. The argument that Afghanistan will descend into civil war, there's actually a counter-argument to that, which is that a U.S. withdrawal could actually increase pressure on the Taliban and the Afghan government to reach a settlement, if only because they can no longer hold the U.S. forces hostage to political developments in the country. The last thing on this is that the thing that's really odd is that despite this, despite the 20 years, despite the trillions of dollars, there are still some people who referred to the announcement as a surprise, even though this deadline is 4 months, more than 4 months, after the May 1st deadline agreed to by the Treaty administration last year. Maybe, I guess it was just like some of us, we actually couldn't believe this war was actually ending. And it's time for a break. And we are back. And we are back with an occasional segment around here called Noted in Passing, where we touch on a couple of things, basically quickly, just not spending a lot of time on them, but just wanted to make sure that they got mentioned. First up, the Ohio State Legislature is considering a Gopper-backed bill to change the name of an Ohio State park from Mosquito Lake State Park to Donald J. Trump State Park. So in essence, they want to change the name from referencing one disease-carrying pest to a different disease-carrying pest. So it doesn't really strike me as, a whole big difference. It does remind me of the attempts by the right wing. There was a move to try to have something named for Ronald Reagan in every single county in the United States. At least they had the decency to wait until the man died before they tried to memorialize him. But, all right, next up. Here we go again. Here we go again. Witless Romney has introduced legislation into the Senate to address the looming financial crisis in Medicare and Social Security, a crisis that in the minds of the right wing is always looming, is always imminent, is always about to happen, even though it never actually gets here. This time, it's with something supposedly called rescue committees that are going to have a rescue committee for each trust fund. And they're supposed to, within 180 days, come up with the legislation to improve the program and secure the long-term financing. It's claimed that this is a bipartisan effort because of the 12 sponsors, 12 co-sponsors in the Senate, 3 of them are Democrats. The 3 are Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and Mark Warner. Truly an ideologically varied group. Oh, and by the way, we have long known the best way to secure the long-term financial security of Medicare. Remove the cap on income subject to the taxes involved. That would only affect people making over $143,000 a year. That is the richest 8% of Americans. But of course, there's the rub. This would mean taxing the rich, which of course means it's off the table. On a happier note, here's another sign that Israel is finally losing its stranglehold on U.S. policy in the Middle East as progressives and even liberals become more open to questioning the special relationship. On April 19th, Elizabeth Warren, while continuing to support military aid to Israel, proposed conditioning that aid on a requirement that none of it be used in the occupied territories, saying, and I'm quoting her, "By continuing to provide military aid without restriction, we provide no incentive for Israel to adjust course." And this is not a very radical idea by any means. In fact, personally, I would just cut off the military aid altogether. But the fact is, it wasn't that very long ago that even suggesting the idea that Israel had to alter course was beyond the pale. Now, on an unhappy note, the Arkansas House of Representatives has overwhelmingly passed a resolution specifically allowing for the teaching of creationism in public schools. Now, federal courts, including in a case specifically involving Arkansas, have repeatedly ruled that teaching creationism in public schools is unconstitutional because it is an endorsement of religion. But the bill's main sponsor responded to that fact by saying that she's hoping that the newly reactionary Supreme Court will think differently about the matter. Finally, for this, while most Americans have managed to weather the pandemic financially, about 38 million say that they are worse off than they were when the pandemic hit. Overall, 55% of Americans say their financial condition is about the same as what it was a year ago. 30% actually say it's improved, but 15% say that they are worse off than they were a year before. Not surprisingly, the problem is particularly acute among lower-income Americans. 29% of those living below the poverty line say that they are worse off than they were last year, when obviously they already were badly off. It also is more acute among non-whites. 50% of whites, 47% of Hispanics, and only 39% of black people have said they have been able to save any money over the last year. Also, black and Hispanic families are about twice as likely as white families to say that they recently have had difficulty paying their bills. And the United States still has 8.4 million fewer jobs than it did in February of 2020. All right, we're going to take a break from all this, going to take a break. We're going to end the show with something I keep meaning to make a more frequent segment, but somehow never do. It's called And Another Thing. This is where we step aside from politics and social commentary to look at some science thing that personally I think is cool. This time we start with this. This is a recently enhanced photo made from an original plate taken in May 1919 in Sobral, Brazil. It is, as I expect you know, a picture of a solar eclipse. It has some added color so that nice solar prominence can be seen very easily, because the original, of course, was in black and white. But that's not the interesting part of this photo. So we're going to zoom in on the lower right corner, as you look at it, the lower right corner of that photo. Now, the marks in the absolute lower right corner are actually printing that was put on the original plate as an identifier for it. But what I want you to notice is two bright spots, a little to the left and a little above that text. To make them easier to spot, I'll throw some circles around them. Okay, and now one more zoom onto those two spots. Okay, what's so special about these spots? Well, as I'm sure you know, they're stars. The thing is, they shouldn't be there. Or more exactly, they shouldn't be where they are. Which brings us to Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity. Now, relativity has the reputation of being extremely difficult to understand, and indeed the mathematics of it are very complicated. They are way beyond my comprehension, at least. But the concepts of the theory can be understood by any reasonably intelligent person. You may have to focus a little bit, but you can understand this. The basic concept to understand is that Einstein realized that we do not exist in a universe of 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension, but that we live in a 4-dimensional space-time. Time and space are interwoven, each affects the other, and neither is absolute. Both can be warped and changed. His original theory of relativity, which became the special theory of relativity, describes effect on space-time in what are called non-accelerated frames of reference. That is, it discusses objects moving in a straight line at a constant speed, or more technically, at a constant velocity. That means if your velocity is constant, that means your acceleration is zero, so it's not accelerated. Now, this became the special theory of relativity because later Einstein expanded it to include accelerated frames of reference, where things are changing their direction or their speed. So that was the general theory of relativity, which also served as Einstein's theory of gravity. Now, unlike Newton, who described gravity as an attractive force between two masses, with the strength of that force dependent upon their masses and the distance between them, Einstein regarded gravity as the result of the warping of spacetime by mass. Mass warps spacetime, and that affects how mass moves in spacetime. So anything traveling close enough to a massive enough object would have its path bent by that warping of spacetime. And that means anything, even light. Okay, the eclipse of 1919 was an excellent opportunity to test Einstein's idea. During an eclipse, astronomers can observe stars appearing close to the sun, which otherwise would be lost in the sun's glare. By comparing their positions with those observations of those same stars at another time when they're visible at night and their positions can be recorded, you can see how much their light path was deflected by the sun. Two expeditions went out, one to Sobral and one to the island of Principe off the coast of West Africa. They're great dramatic stories of the scientific struggles involved there, but they did get enough data to make a determination. Now, Newton's theory of gravity also predicted that light would be bended by gravity, but Einstein predicted more than twice the effect. Newton's theory predicted a deflection of 0.8 arc seconds, Einstein's 1.8. Okay, the stars in this photo are deflected by just under 2 arc seconds. The ones from Principe were measured at 1.6 arc seconds. One a little above Einstein's prediction, one a little below, but still close to it and far away from what Newton predicted. These results were the first observational proofs of the general theory of relativity, and they made Einstein a figure known worldwide, and his other predictions, such as black holes, a subject of a conversation ever since. Which brings me to something else. Almost exactly 100 years later, in April of 2019, a worldwide collaboration of scientists produced this picture, the first ever image of, the first observational evidence of a black hole. Now recall that you can't actually see the black hole itself. The gravitational strength of a black hole is so great that once something passes its event horizon, it can't escape. That's even light can't escape. But matter, as it's being drawn into the black hole, spirals around, becoming extremely hot, and what scientists call luminous, giving off electromagnetic energy, and that's what you're seeing. Now, this study provided an extraordinary test of Einstein's theory of gravitativity and its underlying notions of space and time. 100 years later, we're still finding evidence of the general theory of relativity, and Einstein is still right. As a footnote, what gave me the hook to raise this is this photo, which was released in March of this year, 2021. And the swirling lines visible there are actually evidence of the magnetic field within that event horizon, which scientists are now studying in order to learn even more about black holes, because there's a very great deal which 100 years after the general theory of relativity, we still do not understand about black holes. And I think that's cool. That's it. I'm done. I got to get out of here. You have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. In the meantime, wear the damn mask and peace.